Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Echoes of Shattered Destiny. Episode 22. I hear our girls' night has been cut short. Holly stated as she stepped past the threshold and into the house Maddox had built for me. As she spoke, her eyes scanned the foyer, her head pivoting back and forth to soak up every detail. I hummed my confirmation, motioning for her to follow as we passed through the dimly lit kitchen and into the living room. Sorry about that, things sort of popped up at the last minute. Oh, no worries. I had a feeling something would come up. Truthfully, I'm just happy to be out of the house. She smiled softly, striking a chord deep within my chest as I noticed the similarities between us. Releasing a sound of interest, she spoke. Oh, so many windows. This might sound hard to believe, but I absolutely love natural light. I can't stand being cooped up. That's not hard to believe at all. I murmured, thinking back to the meek and obedient girl I'd met, trapped within the walls of the warehouse our father called his home. Does sunlight hurt you? I never asked how it affected you, being half vampire and all. Holly shrugged, following me out the back door. It's not painful or anything, but I do sunburn very easily. After a while I start to feel a bit tingly, but I've never tested it longer than an hour or two. Well, if you ever want to try again just let me know. I assured her, succumbing to the slight flutter in my chest when she gave me an enthusiastic nod. I padded across the patio and hefted the small box of supplies into my arms, kicking open the door and descended the stone staircase into the field that served as our backyard. It was here, beneath the blossoming light of the moon, that we would attempt the protection spell I'll make sure I call you. Her voice was laced with anticipation, flecked with dollops of hope that made me wonder if a happy ending weren't an impossibility. She bounced on her feet, flipping her ebony braid over her shoulder. I'll admit, I'm a bit nervous, and excited. We're both powerful, I can feel it. There's no way this won't succeed. You think so? I asked, my eyes on the task of setting things up for the spell. More than once I scanned the page, ensuring I followed each and every direction down to the smallest of details. I heard you were doing incredible at calling on your magic, I trailed off. I haven't been doing as well, but I'm trying. It just seems to be a bit more spontaneous is all. Pay attention to what it feels like when you use magic, it'll make it easier to call on it again. I can feel your power, Lola. We're sisters, but your magic isn't quite like mine. It's different. She hummed, closing her eyes, and furrowing her brows together as though she were concentrating. When they popped open, the same shade of blue as my own, they flashed with hidden knowledge. It's older and much more volatile than mine, but there are some similarities too. Our magic is rooted in darkness, but that doesn't make it evil. No matter what you do, or how it manifests itself, remember that. Don't fear it, embrace it. I took every shred of her advice, accepting reassurance from the little sister I'd always wanted but never knew I had. This was what I'd been wanting those months after my father's DH, a relationship where we could talk to one another, where we could recount the experiences and events that led us to where we were today. Are you ready? I asked, stepping into the ring of black pillared candles I created, cradling a few of the rough crystals in my hands. Holly met my eyes, her mischievous grin matching my own. Let's do this. As she said the words, the wicks of each candle went up in flame, bursting to life in one spontaneous whoosh. We faced one another within the circle, a chunk of the dark-colored crystal in each of our hands. Black tourmaline was what the book called it, a stone meant to protect both the witches casting the spell and the subject in question. Within each pillared candle a piece of Maddox's hair was, the smoke thick as it curled into the air and vanished within seconds. I had taken the day memorizing the spell, committing the words to memory. Holly was able to recall them on command, which I found incredibly impressive since my memory was lackluster at best. Every facet of the spell was important, and even the smallest of slip-ups could alter the outcome. The two of us raised the stones above our heads, tilting our chins towards the new moon that hung in the sky. I let out a slow breath, relaxing my shoulders as the words flowed from my thoughts to my lips. I call on the goddess of the moon, mistress of the night and all who walk her path. Come to thee, hear your daughter's cries, hear our pleas cast into the sky. As hard as I tried to ignore it, the amulet Rowena had given me began to warm around my neck. Though the feeling wasn't unpleasant, it was distracting. Holly's voice snared my attention, both calm and confident despite the weight of the spell we were casting. I call on the goddess of the moon, huntress and protector, so merciful and bright. Come to thee, hear your daughter's cries, shine your light on these willing eyes. Holly shouted, her voice reaching its crescendo before merging with my own. Together we spread our arms, embracing the night in all of its beauty, basking in the breeze which quickened in its pace, though none of the candles seemed to register its presence. Our voices became one haunting melody as we shouted into the open air, the stars and moon our only witness. An alpha of blood and iron is whom we wish to protect. Shine your light on him, shield him from the evil that brings him closer to DH. With your might and your love, conceal Alpha Maddox and power in his blood. The wind that had whipped up turned cold, slashing through our circle so sharply that every single went out, plunging us both into darkness. Only the stars and moon, which I swore shone brighter, provided light. So, you think the spell worked? Holly asked several minutes later, once the silence between us surpassed contemplative and turned awkward. We'd gathered the half-melted candles, cradling the crystals to our chests as we placed them in various areas of the house, all places Maddox frequented the most. The two of us were now perched in front of the television, some nameless romantic comedy Mason had forced me to watch playing on the screen. He might have lost his mate in a horrific way, but that hadn't KD the hopeless romantic that hid beneath his baby face. I felt something. I replied, trailing off as I remembered the cold spike of energy that passed through me. From hundreds of feet away, I could feel the shadows that hid within the forest line react to the release of energy. Even after returning inside, I could feel them lingering. They seemed calmer since last night, and if I weren't so tired from the spell, I would have thought they felt almost happier since they'd been fed. Holly didn't seem to register that I'd spoken, and instead her attention was on the couple that filled the TV screen. Locked in a passionate kiss as some sappy song played in the background, the main characters of the movie were oblivious to chaos around them, so lost in one another that the pedestrians on foot and bike had no choice but to alter their paths to narrowly avoid a collision. The look on her face, brightening her eyes and making them appear almost watery, was one of curiosity and longing. I felt guilty breaking the trance the movie had put her in, but there was a question I needed to ask, one that had been plaguing my mind since I woke up this morning. Holly, I whispered, nudging her with my elbow until she blinked rapidly and turned her bleary eyes in my direction. Did you see anything about tonight about Tristan and I's mission? She pursed her lips together, no. You're not a very good liar. I laughed dryly, trying to ignore the way my stomach rolled. No, I'm really not. She nodded understandingly, patting my leg in a gesture that was meant to be comforting. Look, some things are better left a surprise. A surprise? That certainly wasn't comforting. I racked my brain for another question, something that would provide just a shred of useful information, anything to ease my guilt and trepidation. Is there any advice you can give me, anything at all? Holly went silent for a few seconds, and I held my breath waiting for her words I hoped would change what could easily be a disastrous night for Tristan and I. A good leader knows when to ask for help. As always, Tristan had impeccable timing. Not 10 minutes later he stood at the front door, an instant look of suspicion on his face when I opened it. He blocked the way with his lanky torso, not allowing me the chance to slip outside without thoroughly scanning the inside of the house. "Holly still here?" he asked, knowing full and well that she was. I rolled my eyes, sarcasm thickening my voice. "She's in the living room doing a dark and ancient spell that could save us all, but it has horrible consequences." Tristan blinked once, his already milky skin somehow growing paler. "It's hard to tell when you're joking sometimes." "Obviously, I'm joking." I sighed, patting his shoulder as I slipped out the front door. "We watched some romantic comedies and talked about boys." "Really, you didn't miss much. If you wanted to watch us do some magic, I'm sure we could uncover a spell or two." "No, that's all right." He shook his head, pushing back his newly cropped locks with his hand. The look on his face was one I'd seen in the mirror more times than I could count, exhaustion regardless of how much sleep was had. "On second thought, you might need some magic once you see Dot." I stopped in my tracks, standing at the top of the stairs on the front porch. The circular driveway my car rested in was deserted, covered in a thick and eerie silence that enticed me to look even farther, towards the forest that surrounded the house. When I spotted half a dozen sets of eyes glittering just within the forest line, I cursed loudly. "I'm guessing your mate disapproves of your plan," Tristan remarked, his tone brittle and unsurprised. He curled his lip at the wolves watching us, too far to hear our words but close enough to stop me if I tried to make a run for it. "Looks like you get to have your girls' night after all. This is our only chance," I hissed quietly, clenching my fists at my side. "We know nothing, absolutely nothing about the witches doing this." Rowena's words replayed themselves in my mind, so loud that if I closed my eyes and concentrated, I could have easily fooled myself into believing she were here. Tristan lifted one of his pale eyebrows. Despite the dangers of going to the vampire lair, he'd never pass up a chance to help me go against Maddox's wishes. "You've got a plan forming in that devious head of yours, I can tell. What is it?" I didn't answer right away, but instead sent a certain blonde she-wolf a quick mind link. "Hey, Cass! You busy?" I called out, thankful for her speed when an instant jolt of awareness unfolded in my mind. Her voice was accompanied by the sound of music and laughter. "Hey, Lola! I mean, I'm not busy with anything important. I'm at this wedding Maddox's mom put together, figured I'd feel safer around a bunch of wolves." "Why, did something happen?" "Nothing happened, but I need your help with a plan." "You game?" Despite how shaken up she'd been, her voice held a kernel of excitement when she replied. "Yeah, I'm game. Let me know where and when, and I'll be there. Actually, stay where you are, and I'll come to you," I told her, quickly snipping the connection once her reply reverberated in my head. "Lola." Tristan's voice sounded from a few feet away. As I turned away from the forest line and met the brunt of his worried stare, I felt a small throb from the mark he'd long ago put on my neck, the one I still needed to find a way to remove. "This plan of yours, what is it?" "It's not so much of an it as it is a who dot." I snarled at the wolves currently watching us and stormed back into the house, stopping only when I reached the living room and Holly's petite frame came into view. She was in the same position I'd left her in, bundled in blankets like a human burrito with an extra-large bowl of popcorn in her hands. "I'll help," she sighed, speaking before I had the chance to even explain my plan. Her eyebrows were furrowed with a look of worry, and she held up a hand to silence me as I opened my mouth to speak. "If it involves me going out in public, I'd really rather not know the specifics until it's too late to turn back." "Thank you, Holly," I exhaled, my shoulders slumping with relief. With two sets of curious eyes on my face, I rounded out the last details of my plan and said, "All right, we have a few stops to make. How do you guys feel about going to a wedding?" "Well, I can't say I saw this coming. It's nice, in a way. I've always liked surprises, even if I am a bit anxious about going out in public." "Never been to a wedding before," Holly chattered softly, her hands two dark blurs in the rearview mirror as she moved them back and forth, gesturing at seemingly nothing. A small whisper of a smile ghosted across my face as I listened to her ramble, watching as she talked with her hands. I found it both interesting and odd that the same amused expression drifted across Tristan's face, only to be wiped away once he caught me looking. "This dress is nice, Lola. I appreciate you loaning it to me, though I wish it were a bit longer," Holly hummed. The sound of rustled lace came from the back seat as she shifted and tugged the hem down past her knees. "It certainly smells like you, that's for sure." With Holly's wispy voice floating in the background, I focused on the road and on sending my thoughts down the Mate Bond to wherever Maddox currently was. He'd been radio silent all day, which wasn't too concerning since I'd know if anything serious happened to him. Given that the house was surrounded by wolves, his silence made perfect sense. Currently, those same wolves were tailing my car as I coasted around the curvy back roads that led into town, staying just inside the forest line to give me the illusion of privacy. I had no doubt that even if I demanded they back off, they wouldn't listen. They'd protect me with their lives, no matter how much I protested. "Thanks for the personal brigade of wolves, but it's really not necessary." I shot my snarky response down the Mate Bond between Maddox and I, hurling it like a flaming projectile intent on destruction. "You can call them off now, or at least tell them to stop acting like I don't know they're following me." Maddox's reply was instant. The second his calm and collected voice hit my eardrums, I wished he were here, but only so I could throttle him. "I understand you're pissed, but I'm just trying to keep you safe. This isn't how I wanted to do things, but you haven't given me much of a choice. When I get back, we can go to the vampire lair together." For all of his stubborn overbearing ways, I loved the man, but I refused to repeat myself a second time. "You've made me a prisoner in my own pack, Maddox. I won't be forgetting that anytime soon, and more than anything, I promise to make you regret it," I replied, cutting the link between us before he could formulate a response. The longer I kept him in my head, the more of a chance he had at figuring out my plan. "Has he figured it out yet?" Tristan asked, his eyes sliding across the forest line to where I sat behind the wheel. I made a face, something in between a grimace and a smirk. "You'll know once he has. The entire pack will be after us when that happens." Judging from the small building the wedding was being held at, it was initially meant to be an intimate event. As Grandma mentioned earlier, the couple in question had high hopes that a wedding was just what people needed to lift spirits. As it turns out, they were right. There were cars spilling out of the little parking lot, parked alongside curbs and even up on the flat, grassy areas. Dainty paper lanterns suspended on thin fishing wire were what led guests to the front doors, though many just walked around the building to where the party was overflowing into the grass. A hastily thrown together dance floor had been constructed out back, along with a dozen or so tiki torches and streamers in various shades of violet. The sign out front read, Chatham Recreational Center. The music pouring from within was loud and upbeat, matching the laughter that drifted throughout the air. Children darted in and out, weaving between adults who were either drinking, eating, or dancing. There was no order to any of it, but the chaos gave it a homey feel that reminded me more of a family reunion rather than a wedding. So many children, Holly said thoughtfully, nervously fidgeting with the hem of the dress I loaned her. She twisted the lace around her fingers only to release it and repeat the motion. She was lodged in between Tristan and I, sticking close to our shoulders as we maneuvered throughout the crowd. I noted the way her eyes scanned everything with both hesitation and a budding sense of curiosity. It seemed to shake her whenever someone would look her way for too long. They'd hold her gaze until they noticed me standing at her side, then their attention would flit between the two of us until the similarities between Holly and I answered their unvoiced questions. "I'm not entirely sure I like weddings," she said quietly, lowering herself so she could speak the words in my ear. As two children zoomed by, one covered from head to navel in bright splotches of sugary frosting, her look of discomfort faltered. Her lips twitched and eyes followed the children until they were lost from sight. "I do like children, though." We approached the back doors, both of which were propped wide open so that people could run in and out, in search of Cassidy. Further inside I spotted my grandma, who was chatting with Claire and a woman in a sparkling white dress. The veil she wore was thrown back and dotted with little diamonds that twinkled like newborn stars. All three looked relaxed and joyful, laughing like old friends would. Before Grandma could spot me standing there and inevitably uncover my plans, I made a beeline for where Cassidy said she'd be. She wasn't alone when I approached with Holly and Tristan, but was giggling and very clearly flirting with a guy almost 3 times her size. The guy, whose grey eyes were bright in contrast to his dark skin, grinned and devoured every second of the attention. "Oh, Kendrick. This is the one and only, Luna Lola," Cassidy said smoothly, tossing her blonde mane of curls over her shoulder. She sauntered over to me and looped her arm through my own, paying no attention to Tristan or Holly in the process. "Lola has been such a friend lately. She came right to my aid the other night and kicked some serious. Really, it was nothing. You would have done the same for me, I'm sure." I interrupted her, not wanting to relay the details of what it was I did that night. I was still figuring it out myself, and the last thing I needed was for everyone else to make up their own interpretations. "Oh, of course. I owe you one, seriously." Cassidy nodded exuberantly, her sparkly eyeshadow shimmering as it caught the torchlight. She lowered her voice as the thunderous pop music melted into something soft and slow. "This is the guy I've been telling you about. He wanted to meet the Luna, like every other wolf I know." Her voice took on a teasing note as she winked at Kendrick and cozied up to his side. There was a small part of me that wanted to bring up Lars, considering she'd been more than interested in him up until the events of last night. Amelia's warning came to mind, and rather than get on Cassidy's bad side, I said a warm welcome to Kendrick and continued to push things along. Once he ventured off in search of food, I managed to give Cassidy a quick rundown of tonight's plan. I hadn't been sure of how she'd react when telling her why I had to come up with a plan in the first place. She'd been Maddox's best friend since childhood, and I wasn't sure if pissing him off were something she'd feel comfortable doing. Turns out, Cassidy had no qualms over angering my mate. That fact made me like her even more. During the hour we spent at the wedding party, I could hear snippets of Maddox's voice in my head. A few times he spoke through the mind link, attempting to ease my anger but to no avail. Here and there I let a few details slip, little things I happened to see or hear. The music, children laughing, the scent of food hanging in the air, even a quick flash of the dress I gave to Holly to wear. A giddiness settled over me as the time neared to act on my plan. Tristan, Holly, and Cassidy ventured inside the recreational center while I hovered near the doors and waited. A few minutes passed, turning giddiness into budding anxiety, when I began to grow impatient and decided to peek my head inside. Rather than look in the direction of the restrooms, which is where Cassidy and the others went, I found myself looking towards the other side of the room. Apart from a few people here and there, most of the guests had wandered outside to continue partying under the light of the moon. There were a few people perched on bleachers, paper plates on their laps piled with food, but that was it. The lack of people made it all too easy to spot his head of salt and pepper hair, which he seemed to have brushed and styled specifically for tonight. Judging from who he danced with, I could see why. Dad and Flora were practically invisible, absorbed within their own world as they swayed to the gentle beat of the song that filled the room and spilled into the night. One of his hands rested on her hip, while the other cradled hers. There was an awkwardness that would have told me Dad had never slow danced before if I hadn't already known myself, but it wasn't that which robbed me of breath and made my insides twist with guilt. It was the very obvious limp in his left leg, and the constant flashes of pain in his eyes that sent me thinking back to the events of a few days ago, when Grandma had attempted her hand at healing his leg. He'd sounded more than defeated when she'd been unable to do it, yet here he was, still doing his best to dance with the mate he thought had died long ago. It wasn't a wish I put into existence, but a need so strong it overshadowed everything else, even the risky and partially insane plan I was about to follow through on. Dad's pain and beautifully innocent desire to dance with Flora coaxed the electrifying feel of magic from my blood until it rang in my ears and warmed the amulet nestled against the hollow of my throat. There was no time for me to question what I'd done or how I'd had done it, because Tristan had returned. The missing presences of Holly and Cassidy, paired with Maddox's snarl vibrating down the mate bond, told me the plan was officially underway. Your plan's working so far. They're tailing after Holly and Cassidy, but sooner or later they're going to realize they were tricked. Tristan grunted, pulling me away from my hiding spot and around the side of the building. It'll take them even longer considering I gave Cassidy the keys to my car. I smirked and fished a different set from my pocket, ones Cassidy had slipped into my hand when Tristan wasn't looking. I dangled them in front of his nose, a grin developing as his momentary look of surprise shriveled. Hope you know how to drive a motorcycle, because I don't. As Maddox's snarl bounced off my skull and left my ears ringing, I feared he'd already discovered the truth. The tidal wave of worry I'd been seconds away from flat when he snarled. Lola, pull the car over. Now. I let out a sigh of relief. He hadn't figured it out yet. A single tap to Tristan's shoulder told him we were in the clear for now, anyway. Since the helmets we wore left us unable to communicate, the tap system I made up on the spot was what I used to keep him up to date. One tap meant we were safe, and to keep coasting down the back roads at normal speeds. Abiding by the speed limit was slower than simply taking off, but there was always a chance it would keep us from being discovered for just a few seconds longer. 2 taps told him to speed up, and 3 meant we were out of time. You know I can't do that. I told Maddox, forcing to the very back of my mind the loud snarl of the motorcycle's exhaust and the pressure the helmet exerted on my temples. Cassidy's head was much smaller than mine. Sean had been right when he said I had a big head, even if he'd only been teasing. Thankfully, adrenaline was much more potent than Tylenol. I'd certainly feel it in the morning, though. If we managed to live that long. Oh, you'll live that long. Not even DH can keep you from me, not with how much trouble you're in. You won't make it far, Lola. The warriors are gaining on you, and they have instructions to stop the vehicle at any cost. Maddox's grisly voice circled my head, picking up on snippets of my thoughts, little fragments that managed to slip down the mind link. I highly doubt you'd mow them all down. The confidence in his voice and in the dry laugh he sent down the bond tinted my vision in an unsettling shade of red. It boiled the adrenaline in my veins and made my muscles go rigid with fury. As Tristan finished speeding around a curve and brought the bike back into its upright position, he turned his head ever so slightly in my direction. He tapped once on the top of my hand, the one clutching his leather jacket to keep me from flying off the bike. Though I couldn't hear him or communicate mentally like I could with the pack, I knew he was asking me if I were all right. I tapped once in response, wondering if I'd hurt him when I clenched my fists and inadvertently tightened my hold on his torso. "You remember what happens when you underestimate me, Maddox?" I asked, my voice venomous. At the moment, there was no trace of the she-wolf he loved, only the unforgiving nature of a Luna crossed by someone she trusted. The bond between us was still there, still intense, and unbreakable, but the stress of our circumstances forced us down opposing paths. Maddox had changed since the announcement where I revealed what I was to the pack. Perhaps this illogical, overprotective side of him had always existed, but was buried beneath the unwavering strength of an alpha born and bred from polished steel. I wasn't sure what specific moment triggered this side of him, but he'd slowly been spiraling these past few months, sinking to the bottom of his own tumultuous ocean. His reply was instant, tinged with the barest hint of disbelief. "You'd risk your own people to follow through on this plan of yours. Unbelievable, isn't it? Although, I think it pales in comparison to you trying to force me into compliance with an alpha command, as if that's ever worked for you." I laughed bitterly. From out the corner of my eye, I saw something moving within the forest. I craned my head towards the trees, watching with peeled eyes as they all blurred into a massive wall of darkness, the emerald greens and rich browns stolen away by night. Silence radiated down the bond, vibrating the mind link constructed between Maddox and I. Seconds, I waited for his response, expecting nothing less than some flimsy excuse about the lengths he'd go to protect me. When those seconds ticked by and a full minute had passed, I tapped Tristan's abdomen twice. The sport bike we were on snarled, spitting its rage and shooting forward with enough speed to send me sliding off the back end of the seat. I tightened my grip on Tristan's torso, too consumed with Maddox's silence to react to him relaxing under my hold. "Was that a motorcycle?" Maddox asked, his voice unsettlingly calm. A single drop of sweat, chilled by the wind that tried so desperately to hold us back, trickled down the back of my neck. I leaned to the left as Tristan hit a sharp curve without breaking speed, managing a glimpse at the GPS in the process. So close. We were so close to the borders of the pack. Without a doubt, I knew there would be a patrol team surveying the area, but they had no clue who we were or that we were headed their way. Once we barreled through the boundary lines, they most likely wouldn't bother following. I forced the rumbling of the engine and the sound of wind whooshing in my ears to the back of my head, and somehow managed to conjure a response out of thin air. "Nope, that was Maya and I snarling at you." Seconds ticked by and my stomach dropped further. "You clever little brat." Alarm bells exploded in my head, screeching in their shrill tones until my ears began to ring. Saying with the system I created, I tapped Tristan's abdomen in rapid succession. I squeezed my eyes shut to keep Maddox from picking up on any stray images that managed to slide past my grasp and held on for dear life. Lola," the wolves slowed down. "I think they know you're not in the car." Cassidy shouted over MindLink, her voice growing farther away. Two things happened simultaneously. A series of howls split the air in two, and Tristan twisted the throttle to its furthest limits, sending us veering headfirst into oblivion. The chilling song of the warriors DD out everything. Every sound, from the bike's wailing engine to the creatures that lurked within the forest, was silenced by the cries of our pursuers. Only one thing managed to pierce the unsettling veil: the wolves' howling cast over us Maddox's voice. "No wonder you weren't worried about getting past the warriors. Who is driving the car, Lola?" he asked darkly. As Tristan hit another curve, barely slowing in speed, the bike lurched to the right. Even with my eyes clenched shut, I could feel the whoosh of something much too close to my face for comfort. As he completed the turn and yanked the bike into an upright position, my eyes snapped open. I had to backpedal as I realized it was the asphalt of the road I felt, breezing but a foot away from my face. Werewolf or no, a motorcycle at triple-digit speeds with only a helmet as protection would leave me irreparably scarred. "Doesn't matter who's driving the car, Maddox," I shot back. "You did this when you stopped treating me like a Luna and started treating me as only your mate. You are my mate," he bellowed, his anger vibrating the length of our bond until my teeth began to chatter. "I'll find out who's helping you, Lola. Mark my words. I am your mate, but I am also the Luna of the largest pack in the world, and the queen to an entire race of mythical beings. I told you my plan because I love and respect you, but I do not need your permission to protect my people," I replied, instantly noticing the power that filled my voice and thoughts. It matched that in Maddox's, perfectly equal in its intensity. "You can either have the warriors follow the car to figure out who's inside, or you can have them try and catch up to me. It's your choice, but the outcome will remain the same." There was a wisp of desperation deep within Maddox's voice, one he tried to conceal with his aggression and hide by means of intimidation. His anger had never worked on me before, which is why I was able to see right through it. "Lola, this is your last chance." His voice grew impossibly low, full of dark promises that were colder than the chilly sting of wind against my neck and chest. Another chorus of howls pierced the thin veil of night, much closer than they had been before. He'd made his decision, just as I had made mine. "Through high water, Maddox, I will come back to you." The howling didn't stop when we raced through the pack's boundary lines and into what many wolves considered no man's land. A total of 473 miles west of Maddox's pack was Alpha Brands, which we fully planned to steer clear of. Even though it was insanity not to relay the location of the vampire's lair on the off chance we didn't make it back, I couldn't risk Maddox sending a group of warriors to my rescue. The last thing I needed were the vampires thinking I'd come to ambush them. A few of the warriors followed us past the boundary lines, though they didn't dare venture too far. If I had to guess, the ones brave enough to leave Maddox's territory were new recruits, desperate to prove themselves in the eyes of their alpha. When the last wolf following us slowed and darted back to the territory lines, I let out a sigh of relief. The sound was muffled by the helmet I wore and smothered by the snarling of the engine, yet Tristan still felt the need to turn his head ever so slightly in my direction. It was the weird connection he and every other vampire had with their ruler. In many ways, it was similar to the bond between a Luna and her pack, yet there was no direct channel of communication. As convenient, and mildly unsettling, as it was to have Tristan and Giovanni picking up on my emotions, the ability to mind link would have been far more useful. Curled behind Tristan's large frame, I lost track of the time that passed. Unable to see the small screen on the sports bike, I counted the passing hours by how sore my backside was becoming. Silence rang in my ears where Maddox's voice had once been, and even though I promptly ended the mind link between us after promising I'd return, I could feel his lingering presence in the furthest depths of my thoughts, waiting, listening for any whisper that I was in danger. Always the protector, no matter how tumultuous things became. He'll forgive you. You know that, right? Tristan grunted, clearing his throat to regain my attention. I set the helmet onto the seat of the bike and stared up at the flickering sign of the gas station we stopped at, unsure of how to respond. Fastmart, I deduced, even though the blinking letters read FSTMT, was nothing more than a little shack comprised of 4 poorly constructed brick walls. Right outside the front door, whose glass was hazy and covered in half-peeled stickers from cigarette advertisements, were 2 gas pumps. The one we stood at had a rusted number on the handle, as if we couldn't figure that one out ourselves. I looked back at Tristan, still unable to conjure a response. He had never liked Maddox, especially before coming to accept that I'd never choose him as my mate. It was strange to hear his reassurance rather than some clever insult meant to tear Maddox down. I'll go pay for the gas. I don't think this fossil has a card reader. I mumbled. As I fished my wallet out of my jacket pocket and stared down at the slim wad of cash I kept handy, I hesitated. Don't pay in cash. Tristan drawled, if we don't make it back, Maddox can track us through your card and see that we stopped here. It's not much, but it'll give him somewhere to start. He watched me from where he leaned against the pump. It sat at an odd angle, making it look as though it were going to fall over at any moment. I nodded, erasing my look of surprise when he snorted dryly. The start of a plan unfurled in my mind, one created by the slew of intrusive thoughts that explained in explicit detail the many number of things that could potentially go wrong. Well, at least they couldn't take me to my father. Not that I would have minded KG him a second time. If anything happens, I want you to leave me behind and go straight to Maddox. It was Tristan's turn to raise his eyebrows, only instead of surprised, he looked unamused. Sure thing. I'll run for my life and the queen of all vampires to D*E. Who will plan my FL when Maddox murders me for leaving your side? Perhaps Giovanni will forgive me for trying to MR him and for the loss of Brianna's wolf. If not, I'm sure Brianna could prepare a lovely FL. I rolled my eyes at him. So dramatic. Leaving him to his own devices, I turned on my heel and approached the little shack. Through the foggy glass windows, I could see a single aisle of what appeared to be potato chips and some very old-looking candy, along with a tiny counter and a mass of crimson hovering behind it. "I kid, you got any money?" A raspy voice low to the ground asked. The homeless man sitting against the brick wall of the gas station was partially concealed by a large ice cooler. A sign was stuck to the door of it by a single piece of duct tape. Out of order, it read. He peered up at me, his eyes a bright shade of blue. They were made even more vibrant from the dark tattered clothing he wore, and from the uneven mop of ebony hair on his head. Without looking too closely, I fished a 20 from my wallet and held it out to him. "Appreciate it. Garrett in there charges an arm and a leg for a beer, just thought you should know," the man said, jabbing a thumb over his shoulder as he pointed towards the inside of the little shack. He let out a wet laugh and relaxed against the brick wall. I nodded, grabbing the door handle. "Glad I could help." A little silver bell attached to the frame jingled as I pulled the door open. Instantly, I was greeted by the pungent scent of gas station hot dogs and the body odor of who I could only assume was Garrett. The mass of crimson I saw through the foggy window was the man himself, or his shirt, rather. The strength of the man's body odor could easily alert every werewolf in the state that this man was 100% a human. He looked up from his magazine, which had half-dressed women printed on both the cover and backside, and flashed me a greasy grin. "What you doing around these parts, sweetheart?" he drawled, sliding the magazine off to the side. His voice had a slight southern twang, which made sense when he picked up an old styrofoam cup and spat a wad of something dark into it. The scent of stale tobacco wafted between us, deepening the look of disinterest on my face. Getting gas, that's what. I deadpanned. No need to get snippy, just asking a question. He chuckled, his large stomach jiggling. One of the perks of growing up in a pack was that I didn't have to deal with human men. More often than not, human men were insufferable and entitled with their women. Werewolves had the same qualities, but they knew when to back down and submit. Garrett here, had the same haughty tone as most men, speaking down on me like I was some innocent doe. Little did he know, I wasn't just a wolf but a blood-drinking one at that. And I answered it. Put 30 on pump 2, and I'll pay for a beer for the guy outside. I trust you'll make sure he gets it. I replied, holding out my card. Garrett grumbled incoherently and spat a second time into his cup. I walked back to the pump, listening to the homeless man's wet laughter hit the air, followed by the crack of a can being opened. By the time I caught Tristan's interested gaze, the laughter had morphed into harsh coughing. How kind of you, buying the local drunk a drink. He commented dryly. He plucked my helmet from the seat and held it out for me to take, glancing once at the pump. The faded numbers ticked by slowly. I snatched it from his hands and snorted through my nose. At least someone will have a good night. Maybe we'll have one too. I flipped my hair over my shoulder and yanked the helmet into place. A solid 5 minutes later, the hum of the engine filled my ears, and my backside resumed its aching. Counting the mile markers and letting my thoughts drift by as idly as the surrounding trees, I noticed we'd made it about 15 miles before rounding a curve and hitting a long stretch of road. I'd been fixated on the moon as it hung in the sky, shining brightly and free of any wispy clouds, when Tristan stiffened, and the exhaust's rumbling faltered. I tapped his shoulder, not expecting a response, but the bike's slowing speed was answer enough. He must have spotted the sign Bridget told us about, the one with the splotch of glow-in-the-dark paint. I caught a glimpse of the speedometer and grimaced when it read a whopping 10 miles per hour. At that point, I said, lurched to the side to peer around Tristan. It wasn't the distinct outline of a person standing at the very end of the road that made me pale. Rather, it was the rustling I heard coming from the forest, both behind us and on our sides. A chilly breeze kicked up, and the scent of something sweet permeated my helmet. I'd been wrong, so very wrong. Tristan hadn't found what we were looking for, the sign which led to the vampire's lair. Instead, they found us. You must be awful stupid common around these parts, girl, even with a vampire at your side. A loud voice snapped. A woman came into view, emerging from where she blended in with the forest line. Her skin was as dark as the bark that covered each tree, but that was where the similarities ended. She swayed her round hips gracefully as she approached the bike, her full lips curled back in a fearless sneer. She stopped 5 feet away, standing on the dual yellow lines that split the road in two. The leather jacket she wore glittered under the moon, mirroring the light in her dark eyes. For a single fleeting moment, I wondered if they were oblivious to who we were. The minuscule dash of hope fizzled out when the woman spoke a second time. And don't expect me to call you queen, you ain't no friend of me or mine's. Though I didn't dare take my eyes off the vampire, I could see in my peripherals that she wasn't the only one venturing from the forest to stand in the road. In all, I counted 4 others. 2 to our left and 2 to the right. We were surrounded. The humanoid shape at the far end of the road came closer, their features growing sharper with each heavy footstep they took. When I managed to make out 2 pale blue eyes, a wide mouth, and a set of messy hair, I found myself stunned into silence. Go on, now. Take the helmets off so we can have ourselves a civilized conversation, yeah? You can shut off the bike too, won't be needing that anytime soon. The homeless man that had been sitting outside of the gas station came to a stop beside the woman. He brought the can of beer in his hand to his lips and took a long drink. "Oh, thanks for the beer, by the way," he said, ignoring the woman's scowl. Several seconds passed and Tristan hadn't moved. His position turned defensive, and I could tell by the way he clenched his jaw that he had no intention on listening to them. I tapped his shoulder pointedly, once again wishing vampires had the luxury, and curse, of a mind link. He must have understood well enough because a second later he cut the engine and removed the key from the ignition. The silence was deafening, but it was the eerie sense of foreboding that thickened the air and raised the humidity. "Now that that's done with, what kind of business you got in these parts?" the woman demanded. Her eyes narrowed into small slivers, but I could still see the gleam dancing within them. "Dina, just KLM and be done with it," the homeless man said. He flashed me a grin that might have seemed apologetic if he hadn't chosen to belch afterwards. The sound echoed across the pavement, sending the rancid scent of stale beer and sour breath in every direction. The woman at his side wrinkled her nose but didn't tear her eyes away from Tristan and me. The man shrugged indifferently. "Sorry, doll face. Buying me a beer won't save ye, even if you are the queen." His words stirred something deep within me, a feeling that unfurled in my chest like the blood-soaked petals of a freshly plucked rose. I slid off the back end of the bike, feeling the vampires on either side of us stir. Tristan didn't dare stop me, but instead followed my lead and lifted his leg over the bike before knocking the kickstand into place. I took a few steps towards the man and woman, stopping at Tristan's side. "Clearly you need a queen if you think KG me is a smart idea, but what do I know? It's not like I'm the Luna of the largest pack in the world." "Oh, and laying off the beers might help too," I replied, skewering him with my stare for a couple long seconds before turning my attention to Dina, the female vampire. "I'm here looking for a vampire lair, and it looks like I've found it." The male opened his mouth to respond but was silenced when Dina raised her hand. On either side of us, the vampires stirred and shifted restlessly. Clearly, Dina had some sort of sway here, but I couldn't be sure how much. "You aren't found nothing, and if you're smart you'll take your out of here before I change my mind," she snapped. I wasn't fazed, even if her voice was laced with fire. Something about her reminded me of a dragon, huffing smoke into the air as a warning. Unlike the drunken vampire at her side, intelligence flickered in her eyes. "You're smart, I can tell. You don't want the trouble of kidnapping or murdering me, not without knowing if my mate and the rest of the pack know where I am, which they do. There's a reason you didn't join the rest of your lair and help the witches when they sought you out, which is a good thing considering they infiltrated my pack. It's comforting to know Bridget wasn't lying, though she could have saved me some time by warning me about Frank Gallagher over here," I replied confidently, smirking when the male's face reddened and contorted in anger. "The F***K is that?" he bellowed, crushing the beer can in his hand. Dina whirled around with such fury in her eyes that I found myself waiting for her to breathe actual flame. "Either shut your mouth or go to Garrett's and keep watch," she snarled, jabbing a finger into his chest. When he clamped his lips together and tossed the crumpled can to the side of the road, Dina turned back to the two of us. "What do you know about Bridget? Where is she?" She had the same fury raging in her eyes. It was powerful enough to make me doubt our safety. Clearly, she cared about Bridget. Did she care about her enough to try and harm us? "Bridget is alive. Who do you think gave me the directions to your lair?" Dina pursed her lips. "You torture her for the information? Bridget wouldn't give up our location any other way." I shook my head, she's unharmed, but the same can't be said for the other vampires. I defended myself when they attacked, but I didn't kill them, and neither did anyone in my pack. To the left of us, I heard what I thought was a choked sob. When a golden-haired vampire keeled over, clasping her hands over her mouth, I knew I'd been right. It brought me no pleasure to see the agony on her face, to watch the shadows deepen along her protruding cheekbones, furthering the darkness that already lingered within her eyes. The male at her side, whose dark hair was slicked into a short mohawk, took her in his arms. She trembled and shook but didn't break her stare from my face. If you aren't responsible, then who is? The witch they chose to follow. I answered truthfully, she's the one who killed them. Dina cleared her throat, suspicion burning in her eyes. How does one measly witch kill that many vampires? She demanded. She wasn't just any witch, but you should already know that. Wait, didn't you know she was the Blood Witch? I frowned, running my eyes over each vampire that surrounded us, soaking in the confusion as it morphed into various shades of HR and realization. Dina's scowl darkened, turning so grim that I had to fight back the urge to shudder. She turned to the vampire that had been posing as a homeless man and said, "Royce, go pull the car out. If what she's saying is true and Bridget survived, Deacon is going to want to talk to her." "What's with vampires and abandoned warehouses?" I asked, speaking to no one in particular. The brakes of the rusty minivan we were crammed into squealed as we pulled into a handicap space close to the front doors. I could make out the symbol painted on the spot, though it had faded over time. Within the parking lot were a few cars, but most looked like junkers rather than functioning vehicles. There weren't any windows apart from the ones that lined the front, but they were blacked out by scraps of cardboard boxes and old newspapers. "This one won't be half as luxurious as your father's," Tristan muttered at my side, his face marred in a permanent scowl. From the front seat, Dina snorted. She turned around and glared at Tristan. "With how flimsy your loyalty is, you got no room to be judging anybody, Tristan." The pale-haired vampire at my side lifted an eyebrow, but Dina didn't falter in her rant. "That's right, I know you. You don't know me, though. I was a nobody back then, a body for her father's military." She jutted her chin in my direction. "I saw you a couple times, scrambling to obey the king and all his whims. It's ironic you're doing the same for his daughter now, isn't it?" I wanted to come to Tristan's defense, and I had planned to, but Dina's words struck a chord in my chest that left me silent. Tristan had been my father's right-hand man. He'd been closest to him, even though my father trusted absolutely no one. Part of me wondered if Tristan's loyalty to me had anything to do with the mark that sat on my neck, or his lingering hopes that I would choose him over Maddox. I didn't have to wonder for long if Tristan would speak up. "Thank you, Dina, for dredging up the years I spent serving a monster who deserved not a speck of the loyalty he received. Everything you said was correct. I don't remember you because I never cared to look your way. As you've already stated, I was busy trying to prove my worth to a king who viewed us all as disposable," he said with a clipped tone. The pale blues of his eyes glittered menacingly as he leaned forward in his seat. Dina remained rooted in place, but from the harsh set of her jaw and the way her grip tightened on the armrest, I knew she was preparing herself for if he decided to AK our new queen. She doesn't see us as disposable. I might have had to prove my loyalty to her, but never my worth. Tristan leaned back in his seat, his severe expression unwavering, even as Dina slid her eyes over to my face. The brooding vampire at my side wasn't one to speak idly, especially when it came to paying someone a compliment. I knew without asking that every word he said, he truly meant. My heart flipped in my chest and took off, pounding harder with each set of eyes that found my face. I couldn't read the emotion in their eyes other than obvious suspicion, not that I had much time to. The door of the minivan slid open, clambering against the side of the vehicle with a loud thud. A shaggy-haired man with a toothy grin and a thin scar above his brow appeared, but the expression fell the moment he and I locked eyes. "What, Dina?" he grunted, but the venom in his voice felt flimsy. "You were supposed to come back with dinner." The stranger pulled open her door and crossed his arms over his chest. Like a queen herself, Dina slid from the seat and patted the man on his shoulder. He visibly relaxed under her touch, and as his eyes softened, I could read the truth within them. He and Dina were mates. "Deacon inside?" she asked him, then jutted her chin in my direction. "Our Royal Highness here decided to pay us a visit. She needs to speak with him." Within an instant, Dina's mate lost his cheesy grin and replaced it with a scowl so fierce I was almost fearful. "Why would I? It's about Bridget. Believe me, baby, he's gonna wanna hear what she's got to say," Dina said curtly, though the sour tone was reserved for Tristan and me alone. Just then, the oddest thing happened. Rather than bark out another sharp reply, or huff in defeat, Dina's mate turned his attention to my face, staring at me long and hard. He pursed his lips, and the scar above his eyebrow rippled from the intensity of his scrutinizing gaze. "She don't know, does she?" he asked, still not taking his eyes off my face. Dina shook her head, glancing my way for a fraction of a second. "No, she don't know, but she's gonna." Her mate's toothy grin returned as he clasped his hands together and rubbed them eagerly. "Wonderful, I love surprises. Let's go then." A sinking feeling encased my stomach, weighing it down like I'd swallowed a ton of lead. Tristan had been right about the warehouse, and other things, but I had no intention on admitting that any time soon. Upon entering, we passed through a set of broken metal detectors, and ventured into a small room. There were nearly a dozen cots laid out in what I assumed was once an employee break room, though the lockers had been torn out. I could still see the imprint of where they'd sat against the wall, and as I looked even harder, I spotted a few broken combination locks scattered about. The counters still remained, along with a sink that looked as though it hadn't properly functioned in the last 10 years. Two vampires perched on a single cot, huddled close together, stopped their whispering as we walked into the room. The woman, whose freckles were dark and cinnamon-colored, wrinkled her nose at me. At her side was a man young enough to be her son, whose hazel-eyed gaze remained curious as we passed through. It wasn't until we slipped through a second doorway that I began to hear voices. One was deep and booming, easily commanding the attention of the others, who murmured anxiously in response. As we passed rows and rows of metal shelves, nearly all of them empty apart from a few moldy boxes, I scoured our surroundings, trying to glean what information I could about this place. "Looks like it was some kind of makeup warehouse," Tristan said gruffly, his eyes darting towards the ground. "See all the trash?" Sure enough, there were flattened boxes belonging to various brands of makeup. I recognized a few, having owned some myself, though the packaging we walked on looked to be a couple years old. Growing closer with each step we took, I heard someone call out. "What we need to do is help the witches," a shrill voice cried out, one bordering on hysteria. "They promised us a place with them, promised we'd have our own land once the werewolves are extinct. If we don't put our trust in them, we have no one. We have to take their offer while it still stands." An eruption of murmuring filled the warehouse, echoing lightly before fading into nothingness. The voices overlapped one another, some frenzied and others tainted with worry and fear. From what I could hear, many of the vampires were agreeing with the hysterical woman. The sound of my own kind contemplating joining the blood witch set my teeth on edge and made a cold chill skitter down my spine. I picked up my pace, slipping past Dina's arm as she reached out to stop me, and blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "You're all wrong. The witches offer you nothing but DH." Tristan's hand came down on my shoulder seconds too late. The words had already been breathed into existence, and all attention was now on us. We stood at the center of the warehouse, a place where the employees would meet up before every shift if the peeling stickers on the floor were any indication. There were more vampires than there were cots, and all of their eyes were on me. Well, all except for one. The man with the booming voice. He had his back turned to us all. I could tell it had been his voice I heard, not because of his giant stature, but because of the sheer force of his presence alone. "The girl is right." His deep baritone rippled across the crowd, silencing them. "Even though her kind offers us the same thing." I was seconds away from lashing out with a response, but Tristan of all people rendered me silent. "There's no way," he said in utter disbelief, slack-jawed as the vampire turned around to face the room. The moment I latched onto those pale blue eyes, I understood. They were the same, exactly the same, identical to the ones I watched turn glossy seconds before severing his head from his shoulders. It was my father's eyes I stared into, but this man, he wasn't my father. "Hello, niece." "What?" I deadpanned, staring at what could easily be my father's clone, like the man himself had risen from the grave and sewn his head back on. I couldn't process the thoughts churning in my head enough to formulate any other response, but I couldn't help but feel as though those 3 words summed things up brilliantly. He had the same thick hair, composed of the darkest onyx, that Holly and I inherited, along with the startling eyes. His build was definitely larger than my father's, but his face, the wide-set jaw and sloped nose, that was the same. The man who claimed to be my uncle, as if that wasn't the weirdest thing I'd ever said, raised one of his dark eyebrows. "Well said. You're Deacon." I managed, my voice a touch suspicious. He nodded imperceptibly. "That's what I'm called. The former king doesn't have a brother. I spent nearly all of my time by his side, and never had he mentioned a brother. How is this possible?" Tristan grimaced, hovering protectively at my side. Deacon snorted at Tristan's reaction, his broad shoulders shifting in the process. The other vampires in the warehouse, the ones he'd been conversing with, stared with equal parts curiosity and contempt. "You think just because you spent your every waking moment preening after my brother, means you get access to his secrets? Try again. My brother would have served your head to the witches on a silver platter if it meant getting what he wanted, no matter how loyal you were," he replied, rubbing at the stubble on his chin as though he had a second, more amusing thought. "No wonder you're following this one around. You must be grateful she got rid of him before he could get rid of you." The teasing and condescending tone laced within his rough voice made me bristle, sending a rush of heat down my neck and arms. "Lola. My name is Lola." "How right you are, Lola," he replied, putting emphasis on my name as he stared at me with those glacier eyes, cold, but not nearly as cold as my father's. "You've changed since you beheaded my brother. You're stronger, more confident in yourself." I set my jaw stubbornly, refusing to break my stare from his, even with all the vampires in the room hovering nearby. "That happens when you kill someone." "That's not all that happened though, is it?" Deacon asked, his tone implying he wasn't expecting an answer. "Luna and the Vampire Queen. You must have your hands full. Does your mate know you're here? Alpha Maddox is a well-known name in this country, though you're becoming more popular by the day." You left out the part where I have a bunch of witches trying to kill me, and yes, Maddox knows I'm here. I kept my voice hard, molding it into granite so nothing could slip through. Deacon crossed his arms over his chest and tilted his head ever so slightly. It was something my father would have never done, a movement that lacked the class and etiquette he had prided himself on. I think you're lying, Lola. I think your mate has no clue you're here, and even if he does, I have a strong feeling he doesn't know where here is. So, what's keeping me from separating your head from your body like you did my brother, and sending your little minion here marching out into broad daylight? At my side, Tristan went rigid. Waves of pure loathing radiated off of him like a furnace, so scalding that I thought he might sink into a defensive position and AK. How would you know anything about Maddox? I snorted, smirking up at the man who had just threatened to lob my head off. I craned my head to the left and right, pretending to look around. As far as I can tell, you're holed up here, in a trashy warehouse. Some leader you are, Uncle. Deacon's lips twisted upwards, and as they did so, I realized why my father never smiled himself. He was horrifying in the same way my father was, eyes glinting with unshod knowledge and cruelty. Even though there were differences between the two, I had a feeling they were alike in more ways than I could count. I have my spies scattered along my web like little spiders. They whisper information down the threads, and I hear it. How else would I know about the murders in your pack, or of your mate's unhinged nature? I can relate, you know. Living with someone cruel and violent is draining, constantly on your guard, wondering when the day will come when you see your blood being spilled. I swallowed a snarl, letting it rumble in my chest rather than giving Deacon the satisfaction of knowing he'd gotten to me. A thought slithered into my head, and rather than play it safe in hopes my uncle wouldn't MR me, I opted for reckless and impulsive. I'm impressed, truly. You know so much about my pack, it's frightening. I nodded solemnly. It affects me so deeply because a certain prisoner of mine, the one who gave me the directions to this place, she didn't mention anything about who you were. I can't help but feel that Bridget left out a huge chunk of information when we last spoke. Deacon's entire demeanor changed. Like a switch had been flipped, the cruel and almost humorous light to his eyes vanished, blown out like a candle whose wisps of smoke trickled and faded into the air. Everyone, get out. His tone was flat, not too loud but not too quiet. Without pause, the vampires surrounding us began to move, bustling towards the fallen shelves, headed in the direction we had come from. You can stay, Dina. He grunted at the last second. The African-American vampire who'd stopped our bike in the middle of the road nodded, and I swore a wave of understanding passed between the two, one I wasn't sure I'd ever understand. Once every single vampire was out of sight, Dina's mate included, Deacon shattered the tension-filled silence. I want you to tell me everything you know about Bridget, and if she was with any other vampires when you found her. His entitled demand coaxed a dry laugh from my throat. Yeah, and I want you to tell me how my father has a secret brother, and everything you know about the witches that want me DD. I retorted, losing some of my steam when his eyes remained unbreakably hard. I knew the look from staring at Maddox half a dozen times. Deacon cared about Bridget, but he was a man carved from steel, honed by cruelty and a past most likely laced with darkness. He'd bend down the world for her, but he'd never let it see him break. Look, she's still alive. I didn't have her tortured or anything. What information she gave me, she did of her own free will. Deacon didn't let his relief show, but I had a feeling it washed over him the same way it had washed over me when I heard Maddox's voice 2 nights ago and realized he was alive. You didn't use any magic on her? He narrowed his eyes as he asked. Yeah, I know about your magic, and I'm not talking about the shadows, either. I wanted to know how he knew, and while I planned on asking that very question, the time wasn't right. No, I didn't use magic on her. Deacon watched me, his expression rigid and unfaltering. I'd long mastered the art of keeping a vampire out of my head, but I couldn't help but reinforce my walls as his stare turned penetrating. I was what the royal family called a backup child. If my brother were to /defect, then I would take the throne. As it turns out, I'm the one that defected. When the eldest child takes over, there's no need for a backup anymore. The only mistake my brother ever made, other than getting his head chopped off by you, was letting me live. Deacon huffed, launching into an explanation I knew was horrendously shortened. I was banished, but I wasn't alone. My brother had already been king for some time, long enough for some of his people to see him for the madman he was. Some of those vampires decided to come with me. Now, tell me about Bridget. There was an itch I needed to scratch, a burning curiosity I needed resolved before I could give him what he wanted. How do you know about my magic? As far as I know, it's passed down through my grandmother, but it was kept a secret for the most part. I grimaced. It was kept a secret because my father despised witches and their magic. My brother, on the other hand, saw only power. Unfortunately for him, our mother died before he ever got the chance to use her in his plans. Deacon replied, then let out a snarl. I've been more than accommodating considering I haven't had UKD on the spot. I won't tell you again, niece or no. What do you know about Bridget? I'd never been a cruel type of person, nor was I someone who lorded information over another person's head, but there was something about Deacon that provoked that side of me. Perhaps, it was his attitude and the way everything he said felt like a challenge, but I couldn't help but feel that a queen, his queen, wouldn't take kindly to someone telling her what to do. Neither would a Luna. Maya grumbled, her hackles rising. I say stick it to him. I wanted to, but I had to keep my wits. Asserting myself as his queen was a must, but I couldn't threaten him, his mate, or any other vampire in the process. From where I stand, neither one of us have any room to be making demands of the other. I have no intentions on harming Bridget, just like you won't harm Tristan and me. Next time you think to demand something from me, remember that I am your queen. You might have been banished when your brother was in rule, but not anymore. Deacon threw his head back and laughed, but it wasn't a sound of joy. You silly child, there is no more kingdom. There stopped being a kingdom when you decapitated my brother your father. Believe me, I'm not complaining, but you're no queen. You chose your side, and us ours. I stood my ground and shook my head firmly. That's where you're wrong. So long as there are vampires in this world, there is and always will be a kingdom. I can feel it in my blood, in every single vampire that chooses to follow me. This mentality that there are sides to pick is what will get all of UKD, it's what pits all three of the supernatural beings in this world against one another. What I want is to end that, once and for all. No more sides, no more forcing witches into hiding or barring vampires from living on an alpha's lands. It's what Maddox and I want, which is exactly why we've been working so hard to create a safe place for vampires to go until this war is finished, a safe place your mate seemed very interested in. From the darkness creeping across Deacon's face, I was sure he was going to belt out some vicious retort, but Tristan's voice pierced the air first. Lola has been juggling both of our kind's wants and needs since becoming queen, and you have to admit, it's more than her father has ever done. This seemed to halt Deacon's retort in its tracks, giving me a moment to slip in with some useful information. Bridget crossed the boundary lines to my pack a few nights ago, along with several other vampires. They were with a witch, the Blood Witch, who was animating ADD body of a werewolf I knew. They attacked, and I fought using my magic, but I did not fatally harm any of them. It was the Blood Witch that KD'd them, all of them except for Bridget. She slit their throats and left them for DD. A witch in my pack was able to heal Bridget before she died. She was the only survivor. I said grimly, SG back wave after wave of nausea at the thought of all that blood and the lives that vanished in the process. Do you know why they attacked, or why the witch took their lives after infiltrating my pack? Deacon and Dina locked eyes, both of them sharing a knowing look that made goosebumps pebble along my skin. After a few long seconds of silence, listening to the large ceiling fans sway and creak, Dina stepped forward and spoke. A few witches showed up one day, late in the afternoon. Don't know how they found the place, but they did. We let them in, but only because they threatened to tear the place down until we were all in the sunlight. They said they just wanted to talk, but I figured anyone who wants to just talk isn't willing to mr innocent people in the process, you know. Dina frowned. Deacon was at an old supermarket in town, hiding out until the sun set. He was getting us all some food before some of the other vampires started killing humans, so he missed the witches showing up. I didn't want anything to do with them, was about to tell them to go away, but Bridget wanted to let them in. She didn't want none of the others getting hurt, so she let them in. I got back just before they left. I didn't need any of the others listening to the witch's poisonous plans, so I told them all to scatter. Seeing that they trusted me, the witches decided to pitch their grand plan to Bridget, Dina, and I. I heard them out, then promptly told them to F*K off. Guess Bridget connected with something they said, because when I and a few others went for a food run, she was gone. Deacon explained, not a speck of hurt in his face or voice, even though I knew it bubbled deep within. I leaned forward, stopped by Tristan's steadying hand. Their plan, what was it? I held my breath, hoping desperately that this was it, that I'd finally understand what was going on. More than anything, I needed to know why these witches wanted me so badly, why they were willing to kill random werewolves in the pack and stage it like my father's previous victims. Don't know all of it, but they wanted your magic both from my mother's side and my father's. They mentioned there was something special about you, and that their leader was cooking up a spell that would bring you to their side. Deacon replied. I asked them what this spell of theirs did, but they wouldn't tell me. I couldn't help it. I let out a groan and sank my teeth into my lower lip to bite back a frustrated snarl. Deacon's eyebrow twitched, lifting an inch up his forehead. The way he skewered me with my eyes made me feel as though he were trying to pick me apart, intent on figuring me out before I did something dangerous. You didn't let me finish. They wouldn't tell me what the spell did, but they did tell me something else about it, something important. What is it? I asked eagerly, more than desperate for any hint of knowledge that could help me understand why. You might want to get rid of the enthusiasm, girl. It's not good, but it does explain why this blood witch KD my vamps. Deacon grunted, folding his arms over his chest. They didn't tell me what it did, but they did mention one of the required ingredients to complete it. An ingredient? How would that help us? Cordelia's spell book came to mind, along with the various herbs and crystals inside. I couldn't see how an herb or crystal would explain the deaths of numerous vampires. 3 sacrifices from the 3 species that make up the tribrid. That's the final ingredient, and from what I understand, they've almost got what they need. 3 witches, 3 vampires, and 3 werewolves, I heard myself say. The corpses of Carmen and Devon came to mind, both strategically placed shortly after their gruesome murders. It brought me no peace to learn that their deaths were for a specific purpose. Learning the truth had renewed my rage, but also invoked a wave of disgust that made me nauseous. I had no doubt that the witches were more than willing to knock off a few of their own if it meant getting what they wanted. That's why we'll win in the end. Even under Tyler's rule, our pack had more loyalty for its members than the witches. Maya huffed, her tail swishing in agitation. We have to assume they've already sacrificed 3 of their own. There's no reason why they'd wait if they have 3 witches readily available. They probably offered themselves willingly. We know they've killed more than 1 vampire, which leaves, Tristan trailed off, his voice fading but his grimace was answer enough. Which leaves 1 more werewolf. Deacon mused gruffly, one of his thick arms crossed over his chest as he tapped on his chin. The way he regarded me wasn't the way an uncle would look at his niece, but the way a predator would size up its prey. He's shit out of luck, then. We've never been prey, and if he's stupid enough to attack, he'll learn that fast. Maya chimed in, hackles raised and ready to fight. Anticipated Deacon's comment and had a retort dangling off the tip of my tongue. We could nip all this in the bud real quick by just killing you. He shrugged one of his meaty shoulders, you'd be saving 1 of your own. Go ahead and try. I dared him. Off to the side, Dina stiffened. She'd jump in if it was brought to a fight, that was a given. I didn't have to divert my attention from Deacon to know Tristan was glowering at her, issuing a silent dare of his own. For half a second, Deacon looked like he might just take me up on my offer, but after a long pause of silence, he huffed and shook his head. Don't really feel like fending off a feral alpha. I'm banking I'd kill him in the end, but not before he slaughtered half the vampire population. I twisted my lips into a humorless smirk. Looks like hiding all these years made you smart. Good to know. Deacon barked out an amused laugh. You sure you aren't my kid? Can't see my brother removing the stick up long enough to make one. I was about to tell him how unappealing his question was when Dina's mate came sprinting through the stacks of metal shelves. His greasy hair was slicked back, giving me the perfect view of his wide eyes and gaping mouth. If I didn't know any better, I'd say that was his oh shit face. It seemed I hit the nail on the head with my assumption, because the moment Dina spotted him, she was at his side in an instant. What is it, baby? She asked, her tone hushed. Dina's mate wasn't looking at her, though. His eyes were square on Deacon, the earthy tones bright with fear. They're here, the witches, he stammered, swiping his fingers through his hair hard enough to tear a few strands out. Shit, Deacon. They just pulled up. They must have been watching us. What the foo? Relax, Spence. Deacon commanded, his tone firm but not harsh. There was a sort of understanding on his face that piqued my curiosity, if only for a moment. He stared Tristan and I down, towering over us both in height and physique. I knew he was noticing how Tristan had inched closer to my side, his hand wrapped firmly around my arm. Before my heart could thud a second time, Deacon had come to whatever conclusion he'd been searching for. Spence, get the others ready to evacuate. Have them meet at the fire exit on the west side of the building. Bring the witches to me, then join the others. Deacon growled, frowning when Spence scrambled into action, nearly wiping out on some scraps of cardboard. He glanced at Dina. He going to be all right? Dina, whose face had somehow become even more grim and severe, nodded her head. Yeah, he'll manage. Thank you, by the way, for not making him stick around the witches. He's got a bad history with them. You're welcome. Deacon murmured, his brows still furrowed, then jutted his chin at Tristan and me. You can repay me by getting these 2 out of here safely. I'm sure my eyebrows crept halfway up my forehead once I heard him say that. He let out a puff of air that sounded like both a scoff and a snort, but I wasn't sure if it was in response to my expression or Dina's. The dark-skinned vampire stared at Deacon like he had two heads, just as surprised as I was that he was keen on helping me live. Don't think I'm doing you any favors, kid. Turning you in might save my people in that moment, but long-term it'll only lead to our destruction. Best chance we got is if you somehow win this thing, considering you weren't lying to my face about how much you care about vamps. He grunted, puffing out his chest as he stared down Dina. Even though she was a few feet shorter than him, Dina wasn't afraid to put on a scathing death glare. Her spine was rigid, and her jaw set in harsh angles that added to the deadly aura she was giving off. Even her eyes, which were a few tones darker than her skin, seemed to glow with the same scalding emotion on the rest of her face. She had more ferocity than any of the vampires I'd met so far. I bit back the thought that popped into my head before I blurted it out, but that didn't stop it from playing itself on repeat behind my eyelids. Dina would have made a badass werewolf. We're running out of time, Dina. Deacon warned, his voice low and face blank, completely unaffected by her death glare. She cursed under her breath and stormed over to Tristan and me, then jabbed her thumb towards the back of the warehouse. There were more of those rusted metal shelves sitting in rows, wedged so tightly together that I could only manage glimpses at the far wall. Let's go. She barked, muttering something under her breath that I would have caught had I not been lost in thought. Even though Deacon made it clear enough he didn't support my rule, he was intelligent enough to know that the best chance for vampires was in my victory. That decision came with risk on his end, and if he was willing to stick his neck out for me, I needed to do the same in return. Unfortunately, the risk I was about to take came with stakes much higher than his, but I knew there was a chance it might turn him to our side. Worst case scenario, it would inspire other vampires to switch teams. I only realized Tristan was pulling me along when I dug my heels into the ground and forced him to turn back. His expression was equal parts bewildered and exasperated, but that was nothing new. Do either of you have a pen? I asked, my eyes darting between Deacon and Dina. A pen? Girl, we don't have time for this. Dina snapped, rubbing her temple in frustration. I snarled under my breath, feeling the faint prickle of magic ghost across my skin. Then why are you wasting time when you could be finding me a pen? Here, kid. Deacon's gravelly voice called from a few feet away. He stood off to the side, a pen in his meaty fist. While Dina and I had been snapping at one another, Deacon had quietly done as I asked. I rushed over and snatched it from him. It was a bit rougher than I intended, but the prickling sensation telling me the witches were nearing was growing stronger, putting me more and more on edge. Hastily, I glanced around for any shred of paper I could find, but there was nothing, but trampled bits of cardboard crushed to the warehouse floor. Without hesitating, I grabbed Deacon's hand and flipped it over. He didn't fight or question me as I scribbled messily across his palm, running the tip of the ballpoint over his calluses and weathered skin. This is where you'll find Bridget, alive and unharmed. Don't bring anyone you don't fully trust with you. I both pleaded and ordered. There are a total of 5 people in this world who have the information I just gave you. I can't stress this part enough. Protect these coordinates with your life. This time, Deacon did react. One of his bushy eyebrows lifted an inch as a flicker of surprise crossed his face. He grumbled, this wouldn't happen to be the location of that safe haven some of the others were whispering about, is it? I didn't answer his question with a simple yes or no. In my eyes and in the rigid way I stood was all of the experience I'd accumulated in such a short amount of time. There was still so much I needed to learn as both Queen and Luna, so much maturing I still had left to do, but the Lola that had ran from her old pack and boyfriend like a coward was no more. In her place was someone new, someone both strong and vulnerable, with so much more to lose. I'm risking the lives of innocent vampires by giving you this. Do not make me regret it. A hand wrapped around my upper arm, and knew then that it was time to go. Deacon's expression was guarded, a blank mask that watched stoically as Dina led Tristan and I away. The slight nod he gave me was the last thing I saw before we vanished behind the rusted shelving. What do you think that meant? Maya asked, both curious and just a tad worried. Dina began to weave in and out of the stacks, inching us closer to the back of the warehouse. She seemed to know which aisles weren't jam-packed with the skeletons of old boxes, making it easier to keep our steps as quiet as possible. I have no clue, but I'm hoping it's his way of thanking us. Anything else would mean disaster. When the scuffle of two dainty pairs of feet hitting the warehouse floor found my ears, I had no choice but to tune my wolf out and strain to listen. I must have slowed because Dina turned back and frowned. She cupped her ear and pointed in the direction we had just come from, a question unraveling across her face. Assuming she was asking if the witches were here, I nodded. Can you hear them? I whispered with a voice so quiet that even I had to strain to hear every other word. Dina's eyes flickered to my lips for a second when she mouthed, a little. We continued moving through the stacks, concealed by the metal shelving and the decomposed boxes that remained. Even on sections of the shelves where nothing sat, there were so many in a single row that it was nearly impossible to spot us through them. I was able to make out the exit sign when a feeling slammed into my gut so hard that I came to a standstill. Hello, Deacon. Our mistress wants to know if you've changed your mind about joining us. A familiar voice said, somehow managing to sound both vicious and cloyingly sweet. Even though I was more than interested in hearing Deacon's reply, it wasn't what made me stop. There was this sudden rush of familiarity that swelled in my stomach, making it plummet to the warehouse floor. I felt a harsh tug on my sleeve and whipped my head to the side to lock eyes with a stone-faced Dina. She jutted her chin towards the exit, which was a few rows of shelves behind where we stood, and tugged a second time. Not yet. I mouthed, shaking my head. Typically, Tristan would be the one trying to keep me out of trouble, but it was hard to do when he too was crouched, peering through the slim gaps in the shelving in an effort to spy on the witches. I held back a snicker and joined him, stretching my hearing as far as it would go, until the voices at the center of the warehouse sharpened. I guess after spending this much time with me, he already anticipated what I'd do. It was risky, but getting information about the enemy's plans rarely ever came with a safety net. I thought about it, but I'm curious, Deacon mused, this little spell you got going on, what's the endgame? What will killing 3 of each kind accomplish? I had to hunch over and bend my head at an odd angle, but managed a somewhat clear view of them. The feeling churning in my gut came to a head when I spotted the witches. Now I understood why the voice I heard sounded so familiar. It was the 2 witches Brandon, Clara, and I had been running from weeks ago. The ones that had come much too close to catching us. What made things worse is that they were both elementals, a rare and powerful breed of witch that could manipulate an entire element in nearly a dozen different ways. They were amongst the other types of witches coveted for their powers, ripped from their families at a young age and thrust into intensive training, molded and shaped until they were deadly weapons. That was the first thing I'd put an end to once the Blood Witch was 6 feet under. Both of the women stood proud and tall, with heavy cloaks wrapped around their shoulders. They were younger than I thought they'd be and looked to be around my own age. Neither one of the witches replied to Deacon, though one's eyes began to smolder like hot coals. The other stood impassive, her hair the color of wheat and eyes like leaves during the peak of summer. At first glance I thought she had some kind of bangles around her wrists, but as I strained my eyes through the shelves for another look, I realized they were actually vines. They were no thicker than a piece of yarn and crawled halfway up her arms before stopping completely. I could make out the tiny leaves that sprouted in small clusters, curling lightly at the ends. Deacon huffed, the sound deep with amusement. I was slowly coming to realize that was his laugh, even if it sounded like anything but. You can't expect me to just blindly follow this mistress of yours without a hint of what's going on behind the curtain. That's not how I survived all these years, and it sure as shit ain't how the rest of these vampires survived either. Am I just supposed to trust that once everyone on your little list is sacrificed the battle is won? How so I know there isn't more to all of this? Seeing as your mistress won't grace me with her presence, I got no choice but to take my answers from you two. The one with the glowing eyes lowered the hood of her cloak, freeing a tangled mess of ember-colored curls. Her smile was brittle and taunting, twisting her slender lips into a jagged line. Trust us, you don't want her to grace you with her presence. She snickered. As for the spell, once the sacrifices are complete there is one more step, but we've got that covered. That's all you need to know. Through the shelves I saw one of Deacon's shoulders lift in what I assumed was a shrug. I'm inclined to disagree with you. You're asking me to go all in on a game I've never played before and won't tell me the rules we're playing by. If my brother were alive, and it were him you two were paying a visit to, he'd be asking the same questions. The one with the fiery hair didn't seem to like being disobeyed, because not only did she bristle at Deacon's words, but her glowing eyes grew brighter, and her scowl deepened. Her companion leaned forward and placed a vine-covered hand on her shoulder. When she spoke, her voice was soothing and her expression oddly serene despite the tension in the warehouse. Ember, relax. Surely we can give him the information he's asking to gain his trust. Of course her name is Ember. Maya grumbled. I had to bite back a snort at the irony, but it seemed I made some sort of sound because Tristan jabbed me in the ribs with his elbow. Neither of the witches gave notice. They were much too far away to see or hear the three of us, a fact that didn't give me much in the way of comfort. Ember, whose eyes actually looked like glowing embers, let out a sharp breath through her slender nose and nodded stiffly. It'll take a lot more than that to gain my trust, girl, but it's a good start. Deacon huffed. Ember didn't react to what Deacon had just said, nor did she acknowledge he even spoke. We have someone on the inside, someone close to the tribrid that will complete the last act. After that, our mistress will have total control over her physical form. Her eyes flared brightly as she finished speaking, glowing with a malicious sort of victory that set my teeth on edge. I held back wave after wave of panic-induced thoughts as they filled my head, each one more daunting than the next. Now wasn't the time to lose my cool. It didn't matter if there were spies in the pack, if the people closest to me were pawns set out to steal not only my life but my magic and my body, I had to keep my head on straight. Beside me Tristan stiffened, undoubtedly going through the same stomach-curdling emotions as I was. When we made it out of here I'd have to sit down and list all of the people closest to me, going through them one by one until I narrowed it down to those I didn't fully trust, and those capable of such a betrayal. The thought of what names I'd see nearly made me sick. When that happens, and you got the biggest baddest wolf pack in the world on your ass, what will you do then? Deacon asked. There was a tone of mild interest in his voice that I desperately hoped was an act because I was more than certain if he told Dina to turn back with Tristan and she'd do just that. Ember replied while the second witch smiled softly, stroking the vines on her arms like they were timid pets. Her alpha mate won't dare risk her harm by attacking, but the same cannot be said for the vampires. With our mistress appointing you as their new king, you can placate them and keep them in control. Your brother wouldn't have been able to turn down an offer like this. Only a fool would think to refuse. Do you have any more asinine questions, or are you ready to come to a conclusion? I had to narrow my eyes and focus hard on Ember, because the air around her seemed to be moving softly. It was thin curls of smoke rolling off her hair and shoulders that I'd spotted, along with the start of actual heat waves. I couldn't lie, the sight was a bit freaky. I'd seen magic at work in many different ways, but never quite like this. She's going to spontaneously combust. Maya murmured, not at all joking. Deacon barked out a dry laugh and said, I assume you already got your 3 vampire sacrifices, right? That why you took a group of my people into the wolves' territory? The quota for the vampires has been reached, yes. Ember nodded evenly. Then you won't mind me asking why it is that all the vampires in your little group were murdered? Deacon replied, humming quietly to himself when Ember's eyes flashed a threatening shade of red. Even the second witch reacted, her serene demeanor slipping for but a second. You don't think it's only the witches that have spies, do you? Wouldn't be the first time I've been underestimated. The second witch spoke up first. She cut Ember off, who looked like she was gearing up to breathe a column of flame in Deacon's face. Our mistress doesn't like loose ends, which is what they became when they failed to capture the tri-brid. I caught a glimpse of Deacon's expression and instantly identified it as one of understanding. At my side, Dina made the smallest of sounds. It prompted me to glance her way, and as I did I heard her whisper. There's no way he's okay with what they did. That ain't the Deacon I know. Dina's uncertainty was just as troubling as what Deacon said next. I've been around a while, seen a thing or two, and can't help but notice that this plan of hers, the one that ended with 6 of my people dead, was a bit rash. Correct me if I'm wrong, but a powerful witch that's been planning this for as long as your mistress wouldn't concoct a last-minute plan to storm the most powerful alpha in the world's pack if it weren't important, right? Right. Ember replied after several seconds, forcing the word through gritted teeth. Now, why is that? Deacon pondered, tapping his chin. What was so important that your mistress strayed from her master plan and did something this poorly thought out? Didn't realize I was holding my breath, counting the seconds that ticked by as I waited for one of the witches to answer, until I began to see spots freckle my vision. I'd been so tuned into the 3 of them that I barely registered the slight tickle I felt against my ankle. A quick wave of revulsion had me nudging the rat that grazed me away without looking down. I'd seen more than a few scurrying about, and super healing or no, I wasn't looking to get bitten. She's coming into her power faster than our mistress has anticipated, even with the hurdles we've thrown in her way. If she learns to master it before the spell is completed, all will be lost. The second witch said, hovering behind Ember, who looked seconds away from burning the place down. Deacon cocked his head, but his expression was obscured. You mean her power with the shadows? Or are you talking about her witchy side? The same rodent, or perhaps it was a different one, brushed up against me a second time. Once again, without looking down, I kicked it away. I added some extra oomph, silently telling the thing to scram. Brianna was the one petrified by all things creepy and crawly, but that didn't mean I was fond of the beady-eyed cretins. Something about Deacon's question made Ember sneer. Her expression was entirely visible through the slats in the shelving, and full of so much mirth I wondered if she'd actually burst into flame. That witchy side of hers possesses power our kind hasn't seen in centuries. She snarled and took a step towards Deacon, stopping only when her companion placed a hand on her shoulder. It could unravel us all should she ever learn the true extent of it. We've done our part to keep the truth from her hands. We've snuffed out 2 wolves she sent searching for information. Unfortunately, they couldn't be used as sacrifices, but their deaths still have purpose. From what our spies tell us, she's unaware they're no longer on mission. Now, you do your part. Gather the vampires, name yourself their leader, and when the spell is complete and the tribrid is ours, our mistress will reward you with the title of Vampire King. What do you say, Deacon? I couldn't focus on the part about my power and its potential. It didn't matter if it was the answer we'd all been waiting for, the solution to stopping the witches that were on the pathway to taking over the world. Those words were stored away, waiting to be analyzed while I dissected the rest of Ember's statement. The witches had killed 2 werewolves sent out to find information on my lineage, on my magic. Not only did I have to make it out of this place alive, but now I had to find a way to tell my best friend that her parents were murdered, that she was now an orphan. I had to physically hold back the tears and push away the memories of afternoons on Brianna's front porch, chatting with her mom while her dad backed into the driveway. Now wasn't the time to mourn or to blame. There would be plenty of opportunities for that later once we made it out of this place. If I hadn't tuned in upon hearing Deacon's low, calculated laugh, I would have completely missed his response to Ember's question. The sound was both warm and rich, full of amusement, yet it carried a note of trouble I couldn't help but notice. When he stopped laughing, the warehouse fell uncomfortably silent. I know how this ends. He rumbled, I won't be king to a bunch of corpses. I swore I watched the mask of civility Ember wore shatter, cracking halfway up her face to reveal eyes flaming with malice and cruelty. She didn't sound the least bit sorry when she said, what a pity, truly. Our mistress will be disappointed. I, on the other hand, will enjoy adding you to the corpses you refuse to rule over. Deacon took a step forward, his fists clenched. I'd like to see you try, girl. Ember was moments away from charging when the second witch placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered in her ear. Straining my ears, I began to hear what she was saying, but then another rodent brushed against my ankle, all but shattering my concentration. Biting back a snarl, I looked away from the witches, and craned my head downwards. I was about to lash out and grab the thing when I realized it wasn't rodents like I'd thought it had been. It was vines. There were dozens of them creeping and crawling throughout the stacks, inching their way throughout the warehouse. One had been trying to wrap itself around my ankle, but now began to slither towards Tristan instead. Tristan, I whispered, digging my nails into his forearm until he turned to look. He and Dina noticed at the same time. The vampire we were hiding with cursed under her breath and crushed one under the heel of her boot. As we inched closer to the end of the row to put some distance between us and them, I had another semi-clear view of the witches. Ember was smiling now, widely and with complete joy. She glanced at Deacon and waved her hand dismissively. Don't worry, we'll get to that shortly, after you've introduced us to your guests. She said, then raised her voice so that every word was crystal clear as it filled the ground floor of the warehouse. Hello there, Lola. Why don't you and your friends come out of your little hiding spot and talk to us? Our mistress is just dying to meet you. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.